resume.
Mr. Commissioner, I'm just going to take a moment to read out the estimates I've obtained from Council, and I hope that brings some moral suasion to people sticking to their estimates. Mr. Taylor has indicated 60 minutes. Mr. Tyzek and Mr. Prowse for the province have indicated they don't expect any questions. Mr. Harrison for the Conservation Coalition, 60 minutes. Ms. Glowacki for the Aquaculture Coalition, 30 minutes. For both Mr. Buchanan and Mr. Hopkins-Utter, they don't expect questions. Likewise, Mr. Harvey doesn't expect to have questions. Mr. Rosenblum indicates 50 minutes. Ms. Brown for the First Nations Coalition, 60 minutes. Ms. Robertson for MTTC, 10 minutes. And I haven't totaled all of that up. I do expect it leaves us in a position to finish on schedule tomorrow. Mr. Taylor's next. Thank you.
Panelists, you've given evidence already on key elements of the Habitat Management Branch work in your answers to Mr. Martland. And Mitchell Taylor. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Registrar. Mitchell Taylor for the Participant Government of Canada, and with me is Jonas Spiegelman. You've given evidence already about habitat management, some of the work, and I know you've read the policy and practice report that the Commission Council has prepared and has now been entered. But to be sure that we've got some foundational points and principles clear, I'm going to ask you some questions, and without repeating what you've said needlessly, I'd ask if, and I'll start with you, Ms. Reid, can you set out very briefly the key objectives of the habitat function within DFO?
The Habitat program within DFO has two key objectives. First is the conservation and protection of fish and fish habitat, and we do that through the habitat management policy and the strategies that it entails. We also have a responsibility to undertake environmental assessments for the purpose of ultimately making a regulatory decision.
And under what statutes would you be making a regulatory decision?
So our primary responsibility is with the Fisheries Act. We also have responsibilities under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act and the Species at Risk Act.
All right. Speaking generally, or at a fairly broad level, how is the branch structured in order to achieve what you've just set out? And as I understand it, there would be both the Ottawa and the regional component, and I'll turn to you for the regional component, and then we can look to Mr. LeBlanc for the other.
Okay, well, to speak more broadly about the branch in the Pacific region, we have 4 programs. The Habitat program is one of them. We also have a Species at Risk program, an Oceans program, and the Salmon Enhancement program. Within the habitat management, and I should say that particularly the Salmon Enhancement program and aspects of the Species at Risk program directly relate to delivery of the habitat management program. The Oceans program does as well in a more peripheral way. With respect to the habitat management program, the program is organized in a manner that has a few key sub-programs. The first is the Habitat Management Group, which has the primary regulatory responsibility for delivery of response to referrals primarily, and also other types of activities. There's a Habitat Monitoring Group, which does compliance monitoring type activities. There's also a Major Projects Environmental Assessment Group, which focuses on certain aspect of the environmental assessment work, the major project work. From a geographical perspective, there's a regional headquarters with staff there, and then there's 5 area offices. Each of those area offices has OHEB, Oceans Habitat Enhancement Branch manager, and staff that report to that manager. Within our HQ, there's a there's a manager as well for the Habitat program and a number of staff that report to that person. Within the Pacific region more broadly, we have a matrix type organization where areas and region both report line to the Regional Director General, and how that impacts on the Habitat Management Program is that I have line responsibility for the staff in the regional headquarters and functional responsibility for the Habitat staff that are elsewhere in the 5 areas.
All right, thank you. And Mr. LeBlanc, turning to the Ottawa side, what is the structure there as to Habitat?
Excuse me, due to a recent reorganization, we split the Habitat Management Directorate into 2 parts. One is reporting to an Assistant Deputy Minister of Program Policy, and my position of Director of Habitat Management Policy is under a Director General of Ecosystem Program Policy that reports to the ADM. And then the other side is the Ecosystem Fisheries Management, Ecosystem and Fisheries Management ADM, Senior ADM, who has a DG of Ecosystems Program. And under that, there's 2 directors that really support the Habitat program. One, a Director of Operations, and then a Director of Information, Training, and Quality Assurance. So we're split among 3 directors in 2 different sectors at headquarters. One directed at policy, program policy, and the other at more operational. And we're joined with the regions through a national committee that is called National Ecosystems Management Oversight Committee, and that takes care of both species at risk and habitat.
All right, thank you. And I'll stay with you, Mr. LeBlanc. Can you state in outline terms the respective roles and responsibilities of headquarters and the region with respect to Habitat?
The headquarter group is really providing the policy frameworks and tools that are used in the region. So the development of policy frameworks and tools that can be used, such as a habitat policy and any operational policies that we have, and you have a list of those. We also provide advice to regions on major project development, and that's mostly on the operational side. The role of the operations group is to provide that advice to the region, and the regions do the implementation of the policies.
All right, which takes us back to you, Ms. Reid. What do you have to add to the respective roles and responsibilities of the region and headquarters?
So, yeah, the difference between national and regional headquarters responsibilities really is with regard to policy development versus policy implementation. And so we take our direction from national headquarters. We also get our funding from them and our staff numbers. And we get that direction and those resources, and it's our responsibility to implement the program accordingly. And so there's an equivalent relationship with the areas that regionally I hold the habitat funding and staff complement numbers, and then that money is sent out to the areas for delivery. So whereas nationally they have a broad overarching policy direction, regionally we develop guidelines, operational practices, and we work very closely with our area colleagues in the delivery and implementation of the program.
Okay. If you look at, in a binder you have at tab 13 of Canada's documents, and I'm sorry, Mr. Bissett, I didn't pass you a note in advance about the order that I might go to these. Thank you, that's the one. Ms. Reid, do you recognize that?
Yes.
Is that a document that was prepared at your direction?
Yes.
And does that set out in general terms what you've been outlining in terms of the regional structure and setup and work that's done by Habitat?
That's correct.
All right, I won't, in the interest of time, go through it, but I'd ask if that could be the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit number 654.
I'd like to turn now to some key themes that shape the environment that Habitat within DFO operates under and with, and the environment in turn affecting the work done. I'll start with you, Mr. Wang, if I may, and ask you to comment on what I put to you and expand upon it. Some of this you've spoken to earlier this morning, but I believe that there would be more to say. You mentioned this morning that DFO doesn't control land use planning and development. Can you say what the significance of that is in terms of the work you do and the environment you operate within and the challenges you have as a unit?
Certainly, to expand on what I touched on this morning, the function of trying to manage fish habitat is entirely dependent upon how you manage water and land use, because water use and land use activities or actions are what have a direct bearing on what ultimately creates habitat for fish. So it creates an administrative challenge when the federal agency, Fisheries and Oceans, has a mandate to manage, protect, and administer regulatory decisions around fish habitat, but we do not have the mandate to make specific decisions around land use and water use. Those authorities lie with the provincial government and or local governments.
There's a number of actors that each have an influence, and some of them are having a greater influence than others?
Yes, that would be correct. In particular, with provincial agencies, there are some that have a much more significant bearing on fish and fish habitat decisions, or more sort of overlap with things that are also related to fish habitat. What used to be called the Ministry of Environment until the recent reorganization in the province would be an example where within that agency they had a water stewardship division that would make decisions on licensing water for consumptive or non-consumptive use. And any water allocation decision will typically have some degree of bearing on fish, because fish live in water.
It's probably quite basic to say, but nonetheless I will, that different provincial agencies and local governments will have interests and priorities that are competing both with what Habitat is trying to do and amongst each other. I take it that's the case, is it?
Certainly with, in some circumstances with some agencies, whether it be provincial agencies or local governments, there's what would you call it, an administrative sort of tension between competing priorities, where an agency, say like Ministry of Forests, for example, has a mandate to manage forest harvesting and generate economic benefits for the province. And there is a challenge there in terms of managing and optimizing that forest resource while at the same time protecting and trying to ensure that we don't cause any negative effects to fish and fish habitat. So I'm not suggesting by using that as an example that forestry is inherently bad. It's just that the mandate for forest development and forest economic activity does not necessarily align perfectly well with an ideal management strategy for fish and fish habitat.
In the environment that you operate in, how important is the 1986 Habitat Policy as a tool, and how valuable is it?
Well, as I touched on this morning, it's tremendously valuable because it gives the fisheries agency, and even people that are fisheries agency being Fisheries and Oceans, and even other entities like the Provincial Ministry of Environment, something to point to when there is a trade-off or a value issue on the table that will pit an economic development circumstance against a circumstance that would potentially have an impact to fish and fish habitat. And my observation is that we have, excuse me, as Fisheries and Oceans, we have a very strong and powerful opportunity to bring the fisheries interest to the table when those kinds of decisions or trade-offs are being considered from a regulatory perspective. And that's much different than many other wildlife species in the province of British Columbia. Many other things, using an example, say like mountain caribou, don't have a no net loss policy sitting in the background to enable the managers of that species to go to a table where a land use decision is being made and present arguments and some compelling rationale to ensure that the development any impacts from the development are offset. Whereas with fisheries, we have that ability and that compelling policy behind the fish habitat decisions.
So you're getting in earlier.
Not just getting in earlier, but it's on the table right from the outset, but all the way through to a final decision. And it's also supported very strongly by the Fisheries Act, which ultimately gives the department the authority to authorize or not propose impact to fish habitat.
At a local level, which is what you're most familiar with, is Habitat as a branch constantly evaluating what it's doing and what changes to make? And if so, can you elaborate some on that?
Certainly in my time, both as a operational biologist as well as a manager with the branch in the area, it's an ongoing thing to look at the work that is out there, look at the regulatory context that we're trying to represent fish and fish habitat interests in, and to try to look to ways to use our time, energy, and authorities most effectively. Frequently, we try to do that in partnership with others. There's a list, I think, that was prepared, in preparation for today that presented as an example. I think, I didn't total it up, I think it might be 50 or 60 different things that over time the Habitat branch of our department has been largely involved with, that have looked to various partnership or collaborative agreements to work with other agencies, jurisdictions, and at times even with industry partners to work cooperatively in a way that allows us to favorably represent fish and fish habitat interests.
If you look at tab 14, and Mr. Bissett, if that may be brought up in the Book of Canada documents, is that what you're referring to?
Yes, it is.
All right. I wonder if that could be the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 655.
What can you say, Mr. Wong, about the impacts of ongoing new planning decisions and development that occur day by day, week by week, and relate them to what's already gone on before?
Well, the challenge there, and I think it's spoken to largely in the previous Auditor General reports that were mentioned earlier, is that the effects to fish and fish habitat that have happened already are already there on the land base, and they have already taken whatever measure of I guess, reduced productive capacity out of the resource base. And what happens when something new comes along is that if that does have another negative effect, it adds up cumulatively. And that's what the previous audits have found, and that's what continues on today. So it creates a challenge whereby any single development proponent, in their mind, when they look at their project in isolation, it seems reasonable. An effect that they are proposing may not be particularly significant or large, and they will propose that it be reasonable that they be allowed to proceed with that development. And the Fisheries Agency, or Fisheries and Oceans, we find ourselves often trying to represent the interests of fish, both in the specific circumstances of that site, as well as over time in terms of the cumulative results of other development activities in that area.
Ms. Reid, do you have anything that you want to add to what Mr. Wong has been speaking to in terms of the environment and so forth that you as a branch operate within?
Sure. I think what's important to highlight is that the Habitat Management Program is facing an increasingly complex environment, and I mean environment both from a biological, a social, political, regulatory one. And so as as the habitat practitioners go about doing their work, they need to consider a number of changing and evolving factors at all times. And so it's not a simple process. It takes time and consideration. It takes experienced people to be able to do the type of work that's required in order to make regulatory decisions and work consistent with the habitat management policy.
All right. Mr. LeBlanc, anything to add?
No, nothing at all.
Thank you. They can be brought up together. Tabs 1 and 12 of the Canada Book of Documents. These are two agreements, or two MOUs, I guess they are. And I think we have 12 on the right and 1 on the left. I think the one on the left is 2007 or thereabouts, I think, and the one on the right is 2010. Do you recognize those, Mr. LeBlanc?
Yes, I do.
And have I got the dates right?
Yes, approximately. I think one was in 2007, started in 2008, 2007, and this one is 2000. The one on the right is 2010.
Right.
Recently signed under the new organizational structure.
Now, is one the successor to the other?
Yes, it is.
And so the right is the successor to the left.
Yes, correct.
What are these?
These are protocols between the Habitat Management Program and the Conservation and Protection Directorate. They're to outline roles and responsibilities in terms of implementing compliance management regime in the department under the program, Habitat Program.
And is that so as to achieve clarity in roles and responsibilities?
Exactly right.
And in a nutshell, what are the respective roles and responsibilities between those two parts of DFO then?
First and foremost, they're shared, and in some cases, there's a lead with Habitat and then a lead with Conservation Protection. The lead in the monitoring and auditing function is with the program, Habitat Program. The determination of risk associated with a non-compliance is a joint work, and where there is an enforcement action to be taken based on a decision to proceed with a prosecution and conservation and protection, the fishery officer take the lead with the support of habitat biologists or staff.
All right. May the two documents be marked as exhibits, the one on the left being National Protocol between Oceans and Habitat and Fisheries Aquaculture Management 2007 be the next exhibit.
That's item number 1 on your list? which
Yes.
we worked.
And item number 12 on our list, which is the right side of the screen, being a National Habitat Compliance Protocol between Habitat and Conservation Protection within fisheries.
657.
Thank you. If you turn now, panel, to tab 5 in Canada's book, this is a regional document seemingly from July 2009. I'll ask either or both Ms. Reid and Mr. Wong if you want to, one of you, identify this.
So this is a document that was created. I actually referred to it briefly this morning as a document intended to help habitat management staff with triaging or prioritizing their workload as it relates to referrals.
And what specifically does it achieve?
So what it does is it essentially sets out a decision algorithm. So previous to this document, as referrals are received into area offices or into offices, they, in some cases, were treated in a kind of first in, first out type of approach. And there was a view that it was important to make sure that that referrals were reviewed more from a risk basis, that meeting certain criteria, and that proponents would know in a timely manner, when their referral was going to be reviewed, what kind of time frame, what was the likely outcome. And so this document essentially set out the method by which that could be done.
All right, do you have anything to add, Mr. Wang?
No.
May that document then, tab 5 of Canada's book, be the next exhibit, please, being the Regional Habitat Regulatory Decision Framework from July of '09.
Number 658.
If you turn to tab 7 in the binder, this appears to be a PowerPoint presentation, which I expect is right there. Are you familiar with that document, Ms. Reid?
I'm not particularly familiar with it. I mean,
Okay.
I understand what it is, but I don't believe I've reviewed it.
Okay. Does any of the panel have a familiarity with this? Sorry?
Not here, I do not recognize the document.
Okay, no, that's fine. We're going to have Mr. Carter here later, so we can deal with it through him, I think. If you turn to tab 9, there's a 2-page document there. Is that a extract from the Fisheries and Oceans website that sets out the modernization program in a nutshell?
Yes, it is. I think that's pretty correct, yes.
All right. Could that be the next exhibit, please?
Did you wish item number 7 to be marked habitat monitoring update?
Is that the deck that I was referring to?
Yes, I think so. We got a mix up in lists here.
What's tab 7 in Canada's binder, which is a deck dated April 18, 2010, I think we will not mark and we'll simply leave it to a witness that's going to come later this week. The exhibit that was before that one was the one at tab 5, which is the Regional Habitat Regulatory Framework.
That's correct. So you're now referring to tab 9, is it? Modernizing the program?
Correct.
Okay, that'll be marked as 659. Thank you.
I think we're almost through the documents that I wanted to take you to, panel, but on that, I would like to turn to tab 8. Now, this is a document that refers to Habitat Conservation and Stewardship Program, and subject to the Commissioner's thoughts, I don't think we need to mark this as an exhibit, but I'm using it to turn our attention to that program. Is this one that you're familiar with, Mr. Wang?
Yes.
And am I correct that this no longer exists, this program?
Yeah, it was what's called a sunset program or a B-base program, and as the document shows, it ended in end of the fiscal year in 2003.
Can you outline briefly what was it, when it existed, and whether it's left any lasting effects?
Sure, I'll summarize it fairly briefly. It was a program that came about with an intent to provide for a couple of different functions. One was to help to foster, facilitate, or grow the stewardship base from, in particular, non-government entities. Non-government, at least non-provincial and non-federal entities were the focus for the most part, towards management and stewardship of fish and fish habitat. So through that function, there were DFO staff that were brought in, or we hired new staff or we created new positions. They weren't necessarily new staff, but we created new positions and put staff into them to liaise with potential stewardship partners, community organizations, some of them which had been long established, and to try to, I guess in a nutshell, work cooperatively with them and through access to some funding resources, help to provide funding as well as support towards projects, programs, and activities that were for the benefit of fish and fish habitat. There were also some additional positions brought directly within the habitat program for DFO during the duration of the program that were called Habitat Auxiliaries, and they worked quite specifically on well, I guess it depended where you were in the region, but they were an augmentation to the habitat program, with the idea being that it would create capacity within the program itself to develop some new measures, tools, procedures, guidelines, participate in planning and things like that the core program didn't necessarily have the capacity to do. The idea being that if we got some of these things done, we could move past some of the stumbling blocks we had in terms of advancing some new ideas and be further ahead when the program had ended.
And did that work?
I think it would depend who you asked and where you were looking. In some places, as soon as the resources were over, pretty much all the program results dried up and went away. But in other places, there was a very effective and useful, long-lasting effect. An example that I could use to illustrate that would be with the agricultural sector. There's an organization called the BC Cattlemen's Association, and agricultural ranching often has a fairly potentially big influence on fish and fish habitat, where ranches will have streams flowing through them and things like that. And the Cattlemen's Association nowadays have their own stewardship people, and they work with ranchers to help them implement best practices on their ranches. They help ranchers access funding from government and non-government organizations towards implementing improved stewardship on their properties. And things like that have come out of some of the things that were initiated through the HCSP.
Is there anything you want to add to that, Ms. Reid?
Well, I think just to point out that, so this was a discrete program, but it does speak to the relevance of stewardship programs in support of the habitat. And I think also important to point out that this was a limited funding program. It was very successful during its time, and as Jason said, the hope was, I think, that there would be continuity, that there would be enough capacity put into the communities to allow continuation of some of these stewardship groups, and to some limited extent there has been. But I think that one of the lessons we've learned from it is the continued necessity to provide at least some base seed money to support those community-driven grass-level groups. And so to some extent, the Salmonid Enhancement Program does that. But this program simply had a whole bunch more capacity in order to support those groups.
Listening to both of you, would I be correct that one of the things that comes out of stewardship programs is some lasting relationships in certain cases and lasting commitment on the part of those outside of DFO to fish and fish habitat and protecting it?
Yes, I can certainly say that's accurate from an area perspective.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I think that the important point is that protecting habitat is not simply a regulatory responsibility or a compliance activity. In order to protect fish habitat, you need to educate the public, you need to get buy-in, you need to get that broad-based support, eyes and ears on the ground and boots doing work. And these types of stewardship programs are very effective to support that.
All right. Now, the practice or the policy and practice report that's been entered as an exhibit earlier today refers at paragraph 17, and I don't need to take you to this at the moment unless you need to, but it refers to 80% of resources in habitat being directed to referrals. Is that accurate in terms of the regional perspective?
I think from a national perspective, the amount of resources that are spent on regulatory reviews, including environmental assessment, which are driven by referrals that are brought into the department for review, together with a lot of the other activities we do, in general, range between, around 70 to 80%. So that, and it varies by region, but on the general level, that's approximately what it is. It's reducing in terms of that level of effort as people are streamlining the regulatory review processes and undertaking other activities such as participating in integrated planning, outreach, and monitoring.
And so bringing that to the regional level, is that, and Mr. LeBlanc has referred to regional differences, but is that a reflection of the regional percentage here, or is it different here?
There's sort of two elements to the answer to that. So as we heard under EPMP, we created a special group, Major Projects Environmental Assessment Group, and that group is entirely focused on regulatory process type activities. The rest of the program, the Habitat Management Program, is focused on other non-major project activities, and within that group, we have made a conscious effort under work planning to not spend all of our time on regulatory activities, and in fact try and work towards 45-50% of the time on regulatory activities, 20% of the time on monitoring, other elements on stewardship and other types of activities, so that we try to achieve a more balanced approach. But I should say there's always pressure, a lot of pressure to focus more and more effort on the regulatory work simply because of the workload. And that's one of the reasons for that triage document that you referred to earlier, was to try and allow staff to prioritize their efforts so that we could have a more balanced program.
All right. In reference to referrals and regulatory work, am I correct that proponents of a project come to DFO on a voluntary basis as distinct from a compulsory basis?
That is correct. There is no affirmative regulatory duty under the Fisheries Act, which means that proponents do not require to come and seek an authorization or approval from the department, or advice or an authorization.
And as I understand it, most of the work in this area that Habitat does is under sections 35 or 32 perhaps, and maybe a bit of 36 in the Fisheries Act. Is that right?
Much of our work is focused around 35, but as you said, 32. There's two authorizations that can be issued under, and we've combined those into a guide. But Section 36 is administered by Environment Canada. They're responsible for that provision of the Act.
Now, I'm not asking you to give a legal interpretation to acts at all or statutes, but the statute 35 in particular seems to be a prohibition. Is that a fair assessment as you understand it?
Both 32, 35, and 36 are prohibitions. They're different prohibitions, but they're all under the same heading.
And shortly stated, under 35, no one shall do certain things, which essentially boils down to an undertaking that would result in harm to fish or fish habitat unless authorized.
Just to fish habitat, 35. 32 is the section that prohibits the killing of fish by means other than fishing, and 36 prohibits the deposit of a deleterious substance.
Yes, thank you. So is it the case that proponents come to fisheries on a voluntary basis because they'd like to check out and get advice and or some indication from fisheries whether you see or don't see what is loosely called a HAD, as I understand it, or something that would be a danger to fish habitat?
Yes, I think most people are afraid not to comply with the Act, especially the larger companies that have the incentive of their certification under ISO, and as well as some of their investors, so they need to be assured that they're in compliance with the Act.
Does Habitat have an ongoing relationship and working arrangements with what are called NGOs or non-government organizations?
Yes, we have with the Canadian Environmental Network, which is a combination of a national organization, an umbrella organization for about 700 local environmental organizations. We have a National Fish Habitat Coordinating Committee with 4 members from these groups and DFO, and we collaborate on enhancing communication and consultation on policies and on both the development of policies and their implementation, and some collaborative initiatives to work together in certain areas of priority. And we also have a coalition, an agreement with a coalition of 9 what we call conservation non-government organizations, including the Pacific Salmon Foundation, the Canadian Wildlife Federation, the Atlantic Salmon Federation, I should say, and several other Nature Canada, Wildlife Habitat Canada, and groups like that we collaborate with.
And these are national in scope, I take it, are they?
National and to some extent regional too, the major regional ones being Atlantic Salmon and the Pacific Salmon Foundation.
And what is the objective and what is achieved through these working arrangements?
Well, I think it's got several objectives. One is to ensure there's clear communication, and also that we use this forum for consultation on policies, and then we can leverage the resources that they have to help us in some areas where we're not able to dedicate any resources. They've got some of these organizations have a large capacity in terms of to do habitat improvement work, monitoring, science, like Nature Canada, Nature Federation. So these are the groups that we can depend on to do some work that can support our objectives.
And is there similar working relationships at the regional level, Ms. Reid or Mr. Wang?
Yeah, I'd just like to add another organization. Pittsburgh has spoken to a number of them, and but there's also the Salmon Enhancement Habitat Advisory Group, which provides advice. It's a Pacific region constituted body which provides advice, works with OHIP directly, and on habitat enhancement type activities.
Anything to add, Mr. Wang, on that?
I could just add that there are lots of these kinds of relationships that also occur at the more local levels. So there's the national kind of more formal relationship. At the regional level, it's kind of in between, and then locally in areas we have relationships with, sort of local agricultural user groups or something like that, or local watershed roundtable bodies and things. So there's quite a range of NGO contacts or associations that we'll have.
And what, can you elaborate on that? What local relationships, in your experience in the BC Interior, have you seen to exist, and what do they achieve?
Oh, well, they're quite variable. They can go from a group that is very environmentally oriented and advocating for conservation and sustainable type development. They can be partners with entities that are doing some degree of development, and they're looking for ways to align more efficiently or effectively with the Fisheries and Oceans mandate and regulatory agenda. And they can be multi-stakeholder kind of bodies that have a whole bunch of interests in a local area all coming together at what are often called roundtables to discuss multi-interests and multiple priorities. So they're quite a range of things.
At the local level and dealing with projects, perhaps, are there consultations with and engagements of First Nations?
Yeah, there's lots of that. That's a bit of a departure from the sort of non-government organizational cooperation that we were describing earlier. But there's certainly there's a fair amount of consultation with First Nations groups, various levels of that. Could be the band level, could be a tribal association level, or perhaps even more broadly. It somewhat depends on the nature of the issue and the context of a situation, but there is a fair amount of that going on.
Is there a planning process of some description involving the Bridge River First Nation to do with the hydro project, or was there at one time?
Yeah, there is a, I can't remember the formal title of it, but it's with the Statlium First Nation in the Lillooet area. We have staff that sit with that, and the meetings are generally regularly scheduled about, I think 4 or 6 times a year.
All right. Now, there is going to be a panel on habitat enforcement. It's starting at the end of this week, but there won't be any habitat officials on it. There will be conservation and protection officials, but not habitat. So with that, I've got a few questions that I'd like to ask you as habitat officials about it. And first, if I could turn to you, Mr. LeBlanc. Inspector powers were recently removed from habitat technicians, I understand. Is that so? And can you say when and why that happened?
There's approximately over 100 and some odd biologists and technicians in the habitat program that were designated.
That's across Canada, is it?
Across Canada as inspectors. Conservation and protection, the enforcement arm of the department, had advised us that any functions related to enforcement would reside within their program. An inspector designated as an inspector, habitat staff have enforcement powers under Section 36. And there was a decision made at the senior level in Ottawa that inspector powers, that is enforcement powers, would not be provided to habitat staff. The only exception would be fishery guardian status would allow them to have trespass, but no enforcement powers would be provided to our habitat staff for a number of reasons, including safety and the fact that fishery officers are especially trained for enforcement purpose and totally dedicated to that function.
Now, with that, can you explain briefly from a national perspective how it is that Habitat and CMP work together then to inspect and carry out habitat enforcement?
The start is you're going to hear from Dave Carter, I think, on Wednesday about the habitat compliance modernization. There's a group of habitat staff that do monitoring and auditing of compliance. And there's also occurrence that occurs, so there's complaints that come in. Both of those, there is a review to see if there is an issue of non-compliance. And a determination is made between CNP and Habitat to see what the risk is of associated with that with the non-compliance. And if there is an enforcement action required or an investigation followed by an enforcement action, then CNP is responsible for leading that with support from habitat biologists and staff.
All right, and some of that is dealt with in the document that we referred to earlier that is a protocol at the national level, is it?
Correct.
Thank you. Is there anything, Ms. Reid or Mr. Wang, that you want to add on CMP and Habitat working together from your regional perspective?
Well, just with regard to the inspector powers, certainly from a region, we saw a benefit of inspectors maintaining those powers. Because from an efficiency perspective, if a practitioner, a biologist was out and about and saw an incident, they wouldn't have to, and where they could take immediate action, they wouldn't have to wait for a CMP officer to arrive. However, we do understand that there's other reasons to remove those powers. So there was a bit of a conversation about that. And then just with respect, I think I've already spoken to it, certainly the enforcement aspect of the habitat management program overall is an important element. But I think that from a focus perspective, there's a lot of other things that need to happen, and we can't rely simply on enforcement to ensure effective habitat management program.
And
No.
if I can just add to that,
Yep.
something that is perhaps useful for the commission to have a clear understanding of is the relative role that the Habitat staff play in conjunction with the fishery officer staff in undertaking a habitat enforcement procedure or activity. One of the impressions we have, and I say we, lumping myself in with the Habitat program staff, is that the fishery officers are very publicly known. They have a uniform, they have a presence, they're out there in marked vehicles. And it's not necessarily clear, I think, to the general public that the Habitat staff and the conservation and enforcement staff, or the fishery officers, work very closely together. The fishery officers are the experts in procedures, in prosecution, in laying information, in specifically collecting evidence in a way that's admissible in court. But all of that has to be supported very carefully and very specifically by Habitat staff who can appreciate what the impacts are to fish habitat, how do they collect their evidence in a way that they can provide it to a fishery officer in a way that's admissible. How can they know what was there before so they can tell a fishery officer that yes, indeed that site has been affected or perhaps not affected. So the sum of all this is that there's a very significant role in the background when we have a habitat enforcement circumstance for Habitat staff in cooperation with the conservation enforcement staff of the department.
All right, thank you. Asked each of the panel members if you had suggestions that you wanted to make to the commissioner or thought important to make to the commissioner. And he asked you if you would do that without repeating what you'd already said. But if I alter the question slightly to ask if you have suggestions or recommendations that perhaps include and underline what you might have said, are there 1, 2, or 3 that you might want to leave with the commissioner, thoughts that you might want to leave with the commissioner that he should consider? Ms. Reid first.
Sure, thank you. What I'd like to say is that the Habitat Management Program is certainly a regulatory program and a very important one, but I think it's important to emphasize the need to focus on broader strategies and not simply on the entirely regulatory aspect of the program. Certainly collaboration is important, not just with local and provincial governments, but with stakeholders and First Nations. And the resources, I think, are an issue for any program. And I'd say with the Habitat program, certainly the delivery of the program is always with a mind to how we best effectively use those resources available. If there were more resources, I think that what you would see the response would be a sort of a broader approach to how we deliver the program, and I would suggest a more effective one.
All right. Mr. LeBlanc, do you want to go next?
I would, one of my suggestions would be that we look down south. Sometimes we can see what the Americans have done, and one of the things I'm fascinated by in structuring our program in the future would be to use the National Fish Habitat Action Plan as a model where there's an immense amount of collaboration and leveraging of resource among all sectors of society, a more integrated approach at a watershed level, and some monitoring and reporting. And it is a collaborative effort. They're all working towards the conservation and protection of fish habitat.
Mr. Wong, do you have things to add?
I'll just underline a couple that I think I touched on this morning. One is that we spoke a fair bit about the habitat status indicators under the wild salmon policy. And it's my opinion that the idea is good, the tool seems reasonable and functional, and an important next step would be to action and implement gathering that baseline habitat data so that we can, from here on out, chart and measure the performance so that it wouldn't be speculative as to whether we're meeting our objectives or not. And a second point would be to emphasize the linkage between fish habitat management and land use and water use decisions and priorities. And if there is anything that we can do as an outcome from proceedings like this to better align and link and I guess organize the priorities federally, provincially, and with local governments, such that we don't have a fisheries agency or maybe fisheries agencies, counting the Ministry of Environment in there, as pitted as adversaries against development interests, but instead it's more of a cooperative and collaborative kind of approach, where it's not conservation or development, but something that's more along the lines of something sustainable.
My next line of questions, and I won't have enough time to do all of these, have to do with the PPR and some identified corrections that should be made and gaps and clarifications that need to be made. I'm going to ask some questions of the panel, Mr. Commissioner, but as I say, I won't get through them all. And I will be submitting later, and I've alerted Mr. Martland to this, an affidavit that we'll be seeking to file. As you may know, with the PPRs, the Commission Council's directed the participants that the PPRs go in as evidence, and if we have anything that we want to do about that PPR, we should bring it up in evidence. But the practicalities are we can spend a lot of time on a lot of detail. So me running out of time will probably make for that detail going into an affidavit that we'll seek to put in.
And I just would indicate from our point of view as Commission Council, we'll have that conversation with Mr. Taylor as to how we address any questions that we're not able to complete through the conventional way. I think at a general level, we've been slow to move to follow-up questions or to written responses to the PPR in writing, and we've made that clear throughout. So we'll have a conversation about that and see where we stand on it. Thank you.
Mr. Taylor, before you move on, did you wish to mark number 8 on your list to which you have referred?
Thank you, Mr. Registrar, and the fact that you've raised it, I suspect I do. If I could remind myself what it is. That's the one that I said that I don't need to, but I have questioned on it, and I noticed this morning, Mr. Commissioner, if Council questioned, you'd like to have it as an exhibit, so I'm happy if that be the case here. So we'll make it an exhibit then. Thank you, Mr. Registrar.
Item number 8 will be marked as exhibit number 660.
This is, sorry. This, by the way, that was the document that is now Exhibit 660, I think you said, is a program that has come and gone, and one of the witnesses spoke to it earlier. So now with the PPR, I've got some questions of you, panel members, and I'm going to prioritize them and just hit on a few ones in the time available. I'm going to go first to paragraph 36 in the PPR, and I think that Ms. Reid or Mr. Wang has a comment on that particular paragraph. There's a reference there to DFO monitoring chemical contamination and consulting with environment on monitoring plans. Is that pertinent anymore?
No, no, it isn't. Environment Canada has been assigned a response for any chemical monitoring. DFO, or Fisheries and Oceans Canada, has reduced its capacity in that area, and Environment Canada has undertaken that as their responsibility under Section 36 of the Fisheries Act.
All right. If we turn next to paragraph 69, which is on page 29, there is reference there to some new positions and offsetting or not of other positions. Is there a comment that any of the panel members want to make about that in terms of the accuracy there?
My understanding is that this states that there was a reduction, a loss of 24 fishery officers dedicated to habitat, and it appears to be that it was linked to the Expenditure Review Committee's decision where that was overturned. But I understand the decision, and there was 10 positions in habitat that were reduced in that review, the Expenditure Reduction Committee review. and that the reduction in fishery officers dedicated to habitat was due to a reallocation to other priorities within the department.
I won't take you to a particular paragraph about this comment, but there are a number of paragraphs in the PPR that refer to DFO Habitat approving projects. Is that right or wrong that when it says that DFO approves projects?
Under the authority of the Fisheries Act, we either approve harm to fish or fish habitat. We do not approve a project. That's in the purview of the provincial authorities under their legislation.
All right, thank you. We turn to paragraph 155. One or more panel members may have a comment about that. This paragraph is referring to triggers under for major projects. And if you have a look at that paragraph, is there anything that you want to correct or clarify about it, any of you?
From what I saw from that paragraph is that the early triggering policy is not accurately reflected in this paragraph. That policy was put in place to apply the in until you're out principle of DFO. It does not indicate that DFO triggers SIA assessment as early as possible rather than waiting for a proponent to provide information on the project will not harm fish habitat. So there is some correction that needs to be made on that statement.
Mr. Martland has indicated that he'd be amenable to speaking with myself and Mr. Spiegelman about how we deal with the rest of the identified errors or corrections that we propose, and so we will do that. And with that, Mr. Commissioner, those are my questions of the panel.
And I'd suggest we go to break now. Thank you.
Hearing no recess for 10 minutes.